Thank you, Helge, but thank you, CIIS, for remembering Jung. You know, sometimes I think we're in a less psychological time than in 1970 when I went to one of my very first Jungian conferences in Berkeley, and it was called The Forgotten Feminine. And I particularly liked it. It had 3 women analysts talking about a symposium on the psychology of women. But the thing I remember in 1970 was not me going into the room and hearing many Jungian analysts in one place for the first time, but some perhaps Berkeley students or perhaps people just around the campus. One of them was a man with a red bandana on, and he saw the sign, The Forgotten Feminine, and he said, "Who's forgotten it?" I doubt we could say that today. I feel very sad about that. So I'm going to give you some pieces of Jung that have made sense to me in putting together his gigantic opus. And I'm going to speak a little bit against what I would have called once the wonderful appearance of Jung on the scene. And now I think of it as sort of the premature coming of Jung, because somehow something happened where people got an idea of Jung that is very popular, which is that as a young man, very young man, young doctor, Jung studied complexes. And then in midlife, he got interested in psychological types. But he was also thinking about archetypes and decided to come forward with that. And after that, complexes and types were not important to Jung at all. Instead, he was interested in the archetypes, and above all, he was interested in the master or central archetype that he called the self. And then all that had to happen in therapy was people got in touch with the biggest self, and that would shrink the ego down to size, and all would be well. That's a very common image of Jung, in my opinion. And I think it skips over what I think is the important part. And as a practicing Jungian analyst who's actually started his own personal analysis in 1966 and also was beginning to do psychotherapy even before I was going through psychiatric residency, because I was working with Merchant Seaman at the United States Public Health Service Hospital for my internship, and I was in analysis, so I began to listen to their dreams. And so I've had, as I got into the process of actually doing Jungian psychotherapy, I discovered that there's something more to it than just getting the ego to step out of the way and find the capital S self. Because I had worked with Eugene Gendlin in medical school, and my name is on the first paper on the focusing manual, and through him learned a lot about Carl Rogers, I was ready when Heinz Kohut came and finally offered us the idea of the little s self. And around that time, many Jungian analysts as well had begun to talk about little s self. So I'm going to read Jung a little differently than some have read him, and see him as a lifelong search for the little s self, both in himself and in others, and to try to see if that could be foregrounded. And I'm sorry that as Jung talked about it, most often he talked about it as ego, so that certainly Edward Edinger in the early 70s could publish a book, Ego and Archetype. Made perfect sense. But this will be a slight journey to see if we can find that little s self in some of Jung's writings. So let me begin. And And these are going to be little scraps that I get. And by the way, if someone could give me some water sometime or other, this 86-year-old throat will probably run a little dry. In 1917, Jung wrote something in the very first draft of things. One of the two essays in analytical psychology. Remember, 1917 is a year before the armistice that ended World War I. So he was right in the thick of World War I. This war has pitilessly revealed to civilized man that he is still a barbarian. But the psychology of the individual corresponds to the psychology of the nation. What the nation does is done also by each individual. As long as the individual does it, the nation also does it. Only the change in the attitude of the individual is the beginning of the change in the psychology of the nation. So I think we could return to that idea now. We needed it. So in 1917, Jung had finally, thanks to one of the people around him, been introduced to the idea that the issue of psychological types, which he'd been teasing since seeing differences in the word association test on the part of the people taking it, the men who tended to favor to do it in a thinking way, and the women, as Jung saw it, who favored to do it in a feeling way, had made him think there are not just complexes, but types of psychological attitude. It was one of his associates who, he was saying at first there were just two types, thinking and feeling, but he sort of knew there was a type he called sensation, but it was someone else entirely, Maria Molzer, who convinced him and gave a lecture at the Analytical Psychology Club on the intuitive function. And so finally, Jung had four functions, and finally he was ready to start writing his book on psychological types. Now, as I said, a lot of people think Jung gave up there after the 1920s and the 30s. So what I want to do right now is read you a bit of a session with Jung in 1947. This was a memoir left to a Jungian analyst named Vera von der Heydt, who, along with our own Joseph Henderson in San Francisco, probably practiced Jungian analysis longer than any other people. And while she was in training, she made friends with a woman in her middle 40s who was German, half Jewish, and a Roman Catholic. And she had left Berlin forever in 1936 with the idea of going to Australia. And then she found herself in various kinds of hard times and popped up in Zurich. And this woman, many decades later, sent this account of her session with Jung in 1947. So I want to describe three very strange days I had last week I've been here for about 6 months, and I'm glad to be here, and I did not think that there was anything in particular bothering or disturbing me. Last Wednesday, I was walking down the Zurichberg to go to a seminar by Dr. von Franz when I suddenly became aware that I was crying. I was surprised, stood still, but there was no doubt about it. I felt the tears running down my face. I felt slightly odd and did not understand at all what was happening. When I got the sensation of bleeding from the upper part of my body, my hands felt sticky. I thought that I was standing in a pool of blood, and I had to look at my hands to realize that I was not. I was distressed, but at the same time very determined that I would not miss the seminar. So when I passed a chemist shop, I went in, asked for, and got some sort of a tranquilizer. I managed to sit through the seminar, but then I went home, as I still felt decidedly strange in myself. The next morning, I thought that I was all right, but I was walking down the hill. The same thing happened, only much more intensely. There was not only blood, but this time I knew that it came from a wound just under my heart and from small wounds all along my left arm. I got frightened, and instead of going on, I rang my analyst. She told me to go to bed and that she thought I should see Jung as soon as possible and that she would arrange it. On my way home, I passed a small chapel where I always went to Mass. I went in and sat down in front of one of the side altars. I thought this would help me as I felt so panicky. As I sat, I suddenly saw a priest come in, walking up to the main altar and begin to say Mass. This was so unusual for that time of day that I gazed at the figure of the priest. He turned around and I saw that it was the Lord. In a curious way, this seemed right to me. When the moment of taking communion came, I walked up to the altar rails. He gave me the host and then offered me the chalice. This was too much. I drew back. He insisted, and so I drank. It was very, very bitter. And after that, he was no longer there, and the chapel quite empty. I went home, but could not stop myself from crying. In the morning, I got a message that Jung was expecting me the next morning. He did not know what had happened to me. My analyst had only said that I was disturbed. I told him the whole story. He listened very carefully, and then he began to ask me questions. Had I ever had such experiences before? Was I frightened of blood? How old had I been when I got my period? Had I minded about it? What had my sexual relationship been with my husband? Had I ever expected a baby? Had I been unhappy that I had not had children? Had I had my menopause? When had I had the hysterectomy? How long had I been ill? What about hemorrhages? What had I felt before the operations during my stay in hospital? And how long had I felt unwell or unhappy or resentful? His questioning did not stop. He told me through many of them more than once. He took me through many of them more than once, encouraging me to remember, to associate what my feelings had been, and in particular, my bodily pain. After about an hour, I knew that I was back in my body. I was no longer afraid. Indeed, I felt peaceful. We sat in silence for a bit, then Jung got up and told me that he had to leave me. He stretched out his hand, took mine, smiled, and said, "I think that is all, isn't it?" There was no need to discuss or even mention my vision, and he knew that I knew this. For me, this interview was of the profoundest importance. First of all, because Jung had been able to bring me down into my body and into my senses. Sensation is my superior function. For years, I'd attempted to replace it with thinking. I did not want to see or hear or taste, nor be aware of my senses in any other way. I did no longer dare. Jung, so I felt, had accepted the language of my senses and of my body. He had taken my hurt, my wounds seriously, and helped me to dwell on them and to recognize them as belonging to my life and to my totality. And my mystical experience, he had given supreme value by not discussing it. I felt healed in the deepest sense of the word. For the first time, I really understood that healing is a process. It is a constant transformation when one is sufficiently awake. Remember all the different parts of one's being. So that's the report of how Jung worked in 1947. And certainly I hope it makes it clear to you that Jung never abandoned the theory of psychological types. Nor have I, as many of you know, and so it became rather clear to me that it mattered terribly what someone's dominant function is, what someone's inferior function is. And by the time Jung had finished psychological types, he'd given us 8 types of consciousness, not 16 types of people. That comes much later with people who read psychological types, Isabel Briggs Myers and her mother. Jungian talks about 8 function types, and what I'd like to do is show the slide of the spines of consciousness, if we can. Most therapists wouldn't ask quite as many questions in the very first session. Questions put people on the defensive, and Jung's were very circumstantial. They challenged her to answer using this, and gradually it worked. Now, I think that's a remarkable psychological intervention, and it's because of the value of it that as someone who himself had been trained in emergency psychiatry, run the emergency service for an entire year at Stanford Medical Center in psychiatry, I could see, even when I was relatively young, how much type theory has to offer to providing crisis intervention. In Zurich, before we had phenothiazines and lots of psychiatrists in Zurich, if a person in Jungian analysis had a crisis, Jung was the emergency service, and this was the emergency care that he offered back then. So those of you who know my book, Integrity in Depth, will know that I introduced in that book the idea of the spines of consciousness, because integrity is something in uprightness. That's how it's always symbolized in art in Egypt and everywhere else, by this sort of line that stands for standing for something, which is of course what integrity is. And for integrity in depth to really work, I discovered that people need not only to know to identify their superior function, and that's important, Lord knows, but also to be able to have some connection between what they're not so good at. In my case, this works fine. This is always a little dodgy. And but knowing that, living in that reciprocal between a superior and inferior function, so knowing that I'm good at something and knowing that I'm bad at something, kind of keeps me honest. It gives me that integrity and depth. More important, once you get to the inferior function, which may be so other than you, and of course, that I would find this particular essay about someone who had dominant introverted sensation when my own analysis was of a man with dominant extroverted intuition, was me also recognizing in full the value of my inferior function, which perhaps earlier had been a source of shame and as well as of avoidance. So it's been good for me as a therapist to get hold of this theory of types. But the important thing is that once I began to make room for that introverted sensation in myself and to begin to think about it and think about the healing value, not just of this for this woman, but also for me, of paying attention and close attention to things, the particular precise facts of my inner suffering. That experience of the inferior function made me really open to an otherness within myself. And then I found that once that was in place, it made me also more open to every other. And that's really the exciting thing about psychological types, that if you can develop that suddenly, and so that made me want to eventually map out the range. Now, let's not say Jung did this, I did this, but let's say that Jung made it possible for me to do this. So let's go back to Jung in the Red Book and go back to that first slide that we showed, which shows this is the figure of Izdubar, the Sumerian hero that we know mostly by the name of Gilgamesh. And Jung meets him, and they have quite a tete-a-tete in the Red Book Fantasies. And it's a delightful encounter, but not without great risk, because Jung is a stranger wandering through this 3000 BC or so world. Gilgamesh wants to know if Jung has seen where the sun goes down, because he's been looking for the sun his whole life. And he says, oh, well, the sun doesn't really go down. The earth is round. And so the sun just goes to the other side of the earth, apparently for a while, but it keeps coming back. I just about fainted on the spot. He said, my God, does that mean I'm never going to find the sun? And so Itzabar was learning that the world was flat, or not flat, excuse me, wishing that the world was flat, but learning from a modern man who, with the benefit of modern science, that the earth was not flat. Knocked Izdubar flat. He was just absolutely Izdubar flat. He was absolutely devastated, wouldn't stop grieving. And Jung realized that he had to do something for him, and then came a really marvelous moment in the Red Book. And I just invite you to read it yourself. But Jung says, well, you're only a fantasy, so I should be able to save you. And Jung blows a bubble like Glinda the Good around Izdubar and sends him off into the heavens, floating into the heavens. And suddenly he becomes literally constellated as an image in Jung's imaginal sky. And I think that's the moment at which Jung finally accepts what Maria Molzer was trying to tell him. He had a real problem with her. She was the woman who said, "You're not a scientist, you're really an artist." That really made him mad, even though he painted. And he felt that she was a mischief maker and wrote, I'm told, the angriest letter he ever wrote. I've not seen it published, but I've heard about it. But in any case, that was around that time. But I think he did finally accept he may not have been an artist, but he was not an introverted thinking type as he would have longed to have been. That might be what he found in Philemon. He was an introverted, intuitive type. And I think when he puts this upright man standing still with his integrity, but also his magical worldview, into the heavens of his sky and saves him from modern science, or what Jung later called the scientistic attitude. Let's go back to the spines now. That's that Jung basically owns his own spine of integrity, introverted intuition with extroverted sensation as an inferior function. And so I think this makes sense to me of Jung. I think he approached and avoided that, but everything, his building, his making, his work, all of that makes very good sense to me. And that, to me, explains very much about how he proceeded and what made Psychological Types such a brave and interesting book, because he found a way of combining romantic science with the logical positivism he'd grown up in the education of his day in the late 19th century, and was able to make room for two kinds of consciousness when the world had decided that all consciousness equals rational and anything irrational equals unconsciousness. Jung himself subscribed to that doctrine as late as the first version of Symbols of Transformation, Transformation in Symbols of Libido, as published in 1912 before he had his break with Freud. Jung was still saying that there are two kinds of thinking, and one is the rational thinking of the conscious and the irrational thinking of the unconscious. There's a huge shift after the Red Book experiences. And in 1921, when Psychological Types comes out, then he gives fully 4 of those spines that I'm talking about to irrational consciousness and 4 to rational consciousness, and makes them both consciousness, not one is unconscious and the other is conscious. And that's really important, that he had made room for irrational consciousness, and in fact said that when each of us in our psychological types will usually develop at least 2 functions, and one will be a rational consciousness and one will be an irrational consciousness, or vice versa. In my own case, I start, if you haven't noticed, with extroverted intuition, but then I am constantly using introverted thinking to kind of explain and ground it, so you can see in me something of an extrovert, irrational consciousness and a rational consciousness. And you can see that in Jung, so much more, with his introverted intuition, and yet his extraordinary ability to explain depth psychology. Wonderful, wonderful ability to articulate it. That has made us all continue to read him, even when that surprises people. Now, when Jung was ready to publish psychological types, he had actually, I'm looking for a bit of quote right here. He had actually delivered the manuscript to the publisher in Zurich. This is 1920. The book is going to have as its on its flyleaf 1921, but as many books are, it was published in the last quarter of 1920. And he took a trip to North Africa in the spring of 1920. And while he was in North Africa, he was extremely interested and troubled by the difference of the Arab people. It seemed to him to be in North Africa privileging feeling and sensation together in a way that he wasn't used to. It was really quite interesting to him. And the night before he was going to leave on the boat back to Europe, he had a dream. I dreamt that I was in an Arab city, and as in most such cities, there was a citadel, a kasbah. The city was situated in a broad plain and had a wall round it. The shape of the wall was square, and there were 4 gates. The kasbah in the interior of the city was surrounded by a wide moat, which is not the way it really is in Arab countries. I stood before a wooden bridge leading over the water to a dark horseshoe-shaped portal, which was open. Eager to see the citadel from the inside also, I stepped out on the bridge. When I was about halfway across it, a handsome, dark Arab of aristocratic, almost royal bearing came toward me from the gate. And I knew that this youth in the white burnous was the resident prince of the citadel. When he came up to me, he attacked me and tried to knock me down. We wrestled. In the struggle, we crashed against the railing. It gave way, and both of us fell into the moat, where he tried to push my head underwater to drown me. No, I thought, this is going too far. And in my turn, I pushed his head underwater. And I did so, although I felt great admiration for him, but I did not want to let myself be killed. I had no intention of killing him. I wanted only to make him unconscious and incapable of fighting. Then the scene of the dream changed, and he was with me in a large, vaulted, octagonal room in the center of the citadel. The room was all white, very plain and beautiful, and along the light-colored marble walls stood low divans, and before me on the floor lay an open book with black letters written in magnificent calligraphy on milky white parchment. It was not Arabic script, rather it looked to me like the Uigurian script of West Turkestan, which was familiar to me from the Manichaean fragments from Turfan, present-day Xinjiang in China. I did not know the contents, but nevertheless, I had the feeling that this was my book, that I had written it. The young prince with whom I had just been wrestling sat to the right of me on the floor, and I explained to him that now that I had overcome him, he must read the book. But he resisted. I placed my arm around his shoulders and forced him with a sort of paternal kindness and patience to read the book. And I knew that this was absolutely essential, and at last he yielded. Now, I want to make a lot out of that octagonal house and the getting past entryway to the citadel, which is the 4 four-gated city, the kind of four-gated city that Doris Lessing uses as a title for a wonderful novel, if you've ever read it. What I think Jung, of course, there's lots about Manichaean symbolism later in the dream, and Jung took Mani very seriously because Mani felt that the problem of evil was so given that not even God could stop it, but that human beings could perhaps dilute it with consciousness. And so that was something that Jung thought he was so important that in a letter he wrote in 1929, he talked about 4 pillars of the human spirit, and 2 that you might expect here at CIIS were Buddha and Lao Tzu. But the other 2 were Jesus and Mani. I think that Mani's idea of the autonomy of evil has a lot to do with Jung's idea of the fact that we'll always have a shadow and that we have to contend with it, as Jung had to contend, and would call it aus einer Undersetzung, a kind of wrestling with the shadow. Now, what interests me is going from the 4-room house to the 8-room house, because so many people reading psychological types learn sensation, intuition, thinking and feeling. But how many people learn that there are 2 kinds of sensation, 2 kinds of thinking, 2 kinds of intuition, and 2 kinds of feeling? And so that's why you're seeing these little letters I and E on my description of the 8 spines of consciousness, which give us kind of 8 typological pathways to integrity. Now, I think Jung sees in that particular dream a potential to his book on psychological types that he probably did not consciously see, because he called his types of consciousness ego consciousness. I think it would have been so much better if he had seen them as the differentiated map of the many types of little s self that we can find that enable us to have an orientation and make that bridge between whatever culturally trained ego we have and whatever transpersonal self we can learn, that between those 2 is a little less self. So to me, this is a typology. This is Jung's self-psychology, his little s self-psychology, and what he was reaching for, and what his dream was trying to tell him would be capable, particularly if his shadow would read the book. So I get these ideas, and then as a good Jungian, I need to amplify them. So let me show you something that happened in the United States between 1850 and 1860. There was a craze, and it was led by an absolutely fascinating figure whose name is Orson Fowler, and he was very much an American original. So we're going to look at the next slide if we can, slide number 3. Orson Fowler was the leading phrenologist in America at that time. And phrenology had some of the same hold on the popular American imagination that perhaps typology has now. But Fowler was an amateur architect. And he wrote a book that was first published in 1848 and then in a revised edition, came out in 1851, called The Octagon House, a room for all. Remember, Jung goes into this octagon space with the Arab prince, which seems to be the real inner sanctum, the real place of engagement. Well, Orson Fowler had this, and it was a rather grandiose idea, but he had the idea that a house with 8 faces, there were many more rooms within each of the faces than 8, but within the 8 faces would be easier to keep cool in the summer and retain heat in the winter, and had all kinds of advantages for differentiating the various functions that one might want to do in that. And so he created these, and they were built all over America. Mark Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn in an octagon house. And Walt Whitman worked for Fowler for a while in his publishing house at the height of the octagon house craze. So he was right at the American Renaissance. Now, we have an octagon house in San Francisco, so if we could just show slide number 4. Here, it could be a more gracious and more modest home, and I like to think of the self of my dreams as looking more like this than Fowler's, what could seem almost like an inflated ego. This to me is a very gracious house. It's the Feusier, if I'm pronouncing it right, Feusier, and it could be pronounced Feusier, house, the octagon house right here in San Francisco on 1067 Green Street between Leavenworth and Jones, and it was built in 1858. It's a very gracious and lovely house. That's my dream of a little less self that works. It's big enough, it's psychologically minded enough, it's comfortable, but it's also deeply and primarily quite personal. Now, Jung spent a lot of time with the problem of education. And those of you who've studied psychotherapy from a Jungian point of view, as Jungian analysts in training have to do, will know in the book, The Practice of Psychotherapy, there is an essay where he talks about stages of therapy and says there's catharsis, there's elucidation or interpretation. Both of those would be familiar to anyone who knew Freud's work. But then Jung insisted also upon education, and he felt that that was essential before there could finally be a genuine transformation of attitude. Now, in the essay that a Jungian analyst has to read, I think, to get through, is The Psychology of the Transference. And there, right at the end, Jung says, having done this wonderful alchemical imagery and analyzing all the things that happen between the unconscious of the doctor and the unconscious of the patient in a deep enough analysis, Jung says, now, if my ideas remind you of Pestalozzi, that's because we've come to most of the same conclusions. I have never read a Jungian article about Pestalozzi, but I have often dwelled on that, and I don't have the time now to give you the Jungian article on Pestalozzi, but Pestalozzi, but he was the leader of Swiss education reform at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. And he was the one who created an educational system that still is the wonder of the world in Switzerland, that basically eliminated illiteracy among the poor and the peasants. And he talked often about how it was important in educating oneself to use the head and the heart and the hand. And he said each individual is going to do that in a slightly different way. And it's the teacher's duty to find a way that works for them to use their head, their heart, and their hand. Think of Jung using his head, his heart, and his hand. And think about that as what Jung was really perhaps always reaching toward was a little as self that was capable of getting over the ego on the one hand and holding its own with individual human rights against the big S self, so he just wouldn't get lost in the beyond. And then I think you'll see what Jung was doing. Thank you. I've left some time for some questions, so I've told if someone wants to ask would come up and take the microphone from me, then they can be heard by everyone else.
Don't hold it near the phone, not by the speaker.
You see who the inferior functions are like.
Hello, I am humbly in debt for all of your contributions to the work of Jung. I identify as an INFJ myself, the most bizarre of all the types. And my older brother is an ENTP, so we're going to be dueling to death with our NE functions. And I really appreciate all of the contributions you made with the 8-function model, and identify my SI as being the demon function and my NI being the hero function, and gibberish. My question to you was in regards to, I'm doing research currently with the idea of putting cognitive functions on the forefront, and looking at this idea of, for lack of better words, demographical information, one's age, one's ethnicity, things of this nature. Human beings trying to categorize and understand human beings based on that seems to be failing, and it just causes a lot of stereotypes and things of this nature. And looking at trying to push cognitive functions as a way of people identifying with people. So if that is English and that makes sense, what are your thoughts on, pushing cognitive functions on the forefront so that people don't have to try to say, well, how should I view this black guy? Is he, this or that?
He's wonderful. So, well, educate yourself. Just educate yourself. I mean, that's what Jung is saying. Self-education is terribly important. And he wrote books that anyone can read. The difficulty of reading Jung is overstated. It's true that he didn't like to revise, and he would tuck in the references right into the body of the manuscript. But I find Jung far more readable than unreadable. But you have to slow down. You have to take the time. He took time to write, and you have to slow down and take the time to read. And it's a great feast. So I think that I'm constantly educating myself in a variety of ways. Anyone who wants to learn about African Americans should do what I've done and collect jazz singing since I was 15 years old. Someone gave me 3 records, and one of them was Billie Holiday singing I'm Yours and My Old Flame on the back. And because I was educated between the age of 15 and 20, I knew to go to see Billie Holiday myself, and saw her when I was 20, which was a great experience, and so forth and so on. So open your eyes, open your ears. Yes.
My name is Elliot. I was part of this institute 47 years ago when the central focus was yoga. So, and whatever. We studied in a class on Ramana Maharshi. The teacher presented Carl Jung as being afraid of Ramana Maharshi. He said that in a trip in South India, Heinrich Zimmer had told him to visit Ramana, and Jung had actually written the introduction to Heinrich Zimmer's book about Ramana Maharshi, and then he was a few miles away in South India, and he refused to meet Ramana Maharshi. So the teacher presented the theory that Ramana presented enlightenment, and Jung was afraid of ego dissolution. And also Ramana had, the central concept was the self, capital S, as was in Jung, but they defined it totally differently. So Jung didn't want to confront this other definition of the self that comes out of Advaita Vedanta. Anyway, do you have any opinions on why Jung refused to see Ramana?
Well, my trickster has an opinion. It's so much easier to steal in the dark than to do it outside in broad daylight. So I think Jung preferred to do that with Indian philosophy. Yeah. Sure, please come up. You have to ask.
So building on what you just said, I'm just curious about, I asked this question in the beginning of the conference, now I'll ask the same question now, which is, Carl Jung went to India, correct? And did he come across the works of Sri Aurobindo and integral yoga and things like that, from your perspective? Just what his views were.
I wish my dear colleague Richard Stein was alive. He was a Jungian analyst who died too soon, and he knew more about Sri Aurobindo, and that was where he started, eventually became a Jungian analyst. He told me a great deal about it. They were born the same year. You'd think that Jung would know him, but one wonders. I'm sure he knew of him, but did he never seems, as far as I can find out, to engage. But we haven't seen every letter, and one of the things I'm very fond of is, interestingly enough, a man born of an Indian family, Sonu Shamdasani, a good friend of mine who also is this incredible editor of the Red Book and the president of the Philemon Foundation, which is bringing out all the works of Jung, including and eventually all the letters. I think we're going to get more of the story, but I don't have it. And so I feel it's a whole. I feel that Jung was not terribly nice about other people in parallel or in tandem with him. There were a lot of people he didn't say much about. And when he did, it was sometimes depreciating. So I don't know why he was that way, but he was that way. Someone else would like to say something? Yes.
No, nothing online.
I had a question, John,
Yes.
and that is, what is the source of the dream, the incredible dream in the Arab city with the four gates where he wrestles with the shadow?
You can find it in Memory Streams Reflections. And I also have the good news that the original protocols will be published this fall. So we'll actually see what Jung actually said, not what was redacted. I mean, I loved Anila Yaffe, and when I met her, she had the most beautiful extroverted feeling I have ever met in a human being. It was just absolutely breathtaking. But it wasn't exactly what Jung said. I mean, I'll leak you just one thing I happen to know ex cathedra. God did not drop a turd on the temple, on the cathedral. In Jung's own words, God shat on the cathedral. So we want to hear what Jung really said. So I'm sure we'll get an even better version of The Dream of the Arab Prince before we do. Okay. So let's thank you all for being here.